The peculiar affair of the stranger who knocked on Thursday began, as so many of Lord Peter Wimsey's more entertaining diversions did, with a telephone call that interrupted his contemplation of a particularly vexing textual variant in Horace's Odes. He had been seated in his Piccadilly flat, wrestling with the question of whether the poet had intended dulce or duke in a manuscript that some medieval scribe had rendered illegible through an excess of ecclesiastical zeal, when Bunter materialized with that expression of controlled resignation that indicated either burnt crumpets or violent death. "Inspector Parker on the telephone, my lord," announced Bunter, his tone suggesting that Scotland Yard's timing was, as usual, deplorably inconsistent with the proper rhythm of scholarly inquiry. "Ah," said Wimsey, carefully marking his place with a silver bookmark that had once belonged to a Renaissance cardinal of dubious morals but impeccable taste. "Thursday murders, Bunter, always Thursday murders. One begins to suspect that the criminal classes have developed an unfortunate attachment to the day of Jupiter, though I rather doubt their familiarity with classical mythology extends much beyond the more sanguinary episodes." The conversation that followed proved both brief and intriguing. A gentleman of apparently irreproachable character had been discovered deceased in the library of Blackwood Grange, a modest estate in the dampest corner of Sussex. The circumstances were, in Parker's carefully diplomatic phrasing, rather singular. "Singular in what particular?" inquired Wimsey, already reaching for his hat with the sort of languid enthusiasm that suggested murder was precisely what Thursday afternoon had been lacking. "Shot through the heart at close range," Parker replied. "The weapon was found in the victim's own hand, positioned as if for suicide. Only difficulty is, the powder burns are entirely wrong for self-infliction, and there's a curious absence of blood spatter where elementary physics would demand it. Someone has been rather creative with the staging." "How delightfully theatrical," murmured Wimsey. "And our reluctant Hamlet?" "One Sir Alistair Blackwood, aged 57, distinguished philologist, recently returned from 20 years of Oriental scholarship in India. Lived quietly at the Grange with only a housekeeper and gardener for company. No apparent enemies, no scandalous debts, no compromising correspondence. At least, none that the local constabulary has managed to unearth." Wimsey adjusted his monocle with the precision of a man focusing a telescope on a distant star. "A paragon of scholarly virtue, then. How perfectly suspicious. I don't suppose the locals are already murmuring about mysterious Eastern curses and the revenge of outraged Sanskrit manuscripts?" "Nothing quite so exotic, I'm afraid. Though there is one detail that might interest you. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Pemberton, woman of apparently unshakable composure, insists that Sir Alistair was expecting someone yesterday evening. She heard a visitor knock at precisely 8 o'clock. 3 deliberate raps, she said. But when she answered the door, she found only an empty threshold and the sound of footsteps retreating rapidly down the gravel drive. The stranger who knocked on Thursday, mused Wimsey, his pale eyes brightening with the sort of intellectual appetite that made Bunter reach preventively for the traveling case. How perfectly Gothic. I don't suppose this phantom caller troubled to leave a visiting card. Nothing so considerate. But Mrs. Pemberton swears she heard those 3 knocks distinctly. Very purposeful, she said. Very deliberate. As Wimsey replaced the receiver and began assembling the tools of his peculiar trade, he reflected upon the curious psychology of Thursday violence. There was something particularly unsettling about murder committed on so prosaic a day. Mondays suggested crimes of passion, Fridays implied desperate improvisation, but Thursday suggested premeditation of the most calculated variety. The drive to Blackwood Grange carried him through countryside that appeared to have been arranged by someone with a keen appreciation for picturesque melancholy. Rolling downs punctuated by copses that seemed to brood over private sorrows, villages that huddled around their churches like children around a dying fire. It was precisely the sort of landscape, Wimsey observed, that concealed murder most effectively, its very respectability serving as camouflage for the most unreasonable human impulses. The Grange itself proved to be a substantial Georgian manor of honey-colored stone, possessed of that particular English combination of architectural dignity and domestic comfort that suggested its builder had valued both scholarship and port in equal measure. Inspector Parker's motor car stood in the circular drive like a mechanical intruder in an 18th-century conversation piece. As Whimsy approached the front entrance, he paused to examine the gravel beneath his feet with the sort of attention usually reserved for illuminated manuscripts. The surface showed the predictable confusion of official footprints, police boots, the local doctor's sensible Oxfords, the lighter impressions of feminine shoes. But there, just visible in the afternoon light, was something else entirely. A single set of tracks leading from the road to the front door, and then nothing. No corresponding prints leading away. "Fascinating," murmured Whimsy, crouching to examine the mysterious tracks more closely. "Our phantom caller appears to have possessed the remarkable ability to vanish into thin air. Or perhaps," he added with a slight smile that would have alarmed anyone familiar with his methods, "he simply knew a rather more imaginative route of departure." The front door opened before he could apply the brass knocker, itself an elaborate affair, depicting a classical scene that some Victorian Blackwood had considered edifying. A tall, angular woman in her 60s appeared, possessed of that composed expression that suggested she had been expecting him. "Lord Peter Whimsy, I presume?" she inquired, her voice carrying the faint trace of Yorkshire origins carefully modulated by decades of genteel service. "Inspector Parker mentioned you would be coming. I do hope you'll be able to make sense of this dreadful business. Poor Sir Alistair was such a gentle soul, not the sort of man to do such a thing to himself." "Indeed, Mrs. Pemberton," replied Whimsy, removing his hat with a flourish that managed to be both courteous and faintly ironic. "I understand you had the misfortune to discover the tragedy this morning." "At 7 o'clock precisely, my lord. I always brought Sir Alistair his morning tea at 7. He was most particular about punctuality, you see. Oriental habits, he called them." Her voice wavered slightly, then steadied with the discipline of long practice. "I found the library door locked from the inside, which was most unusual. Sir Alistair never locked doors within the house. When he failed to answer my knock, I fetched the spare key from the kitchen." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully, his gaze already cataloguing the details of the entrance hall, the slight film of dust on the console table that suggested recent economies, the faded rectangles on the wallpaper where paintings had once hung, the subtle but unmistakable signs of a household making do with rather less than it had once enjoyed. "And this mysterious visitor of yesterday evening?" he inquired. "You're quite certain about the time?" For the first time, Mrs. Pemberton hesitated. 8 o'clock exactly, my lord. I had just finished clearing the dinner things when I heard the knock. 3 raps, very distinct, very formal. But when I opened the door, she shrugged helplessly. Nothing but shadows and the sound of someone walking away very quickly on the gravel. "Most intriguing," murmured Whimsy. "And Sir Alistair's reaction to this phantom caller?" "That's just it, my lord. When I told him about the knock, he went quite pale. Said it was probably just village children playing pranks, but, he spent the rest of the evening pacing about the library. I heard him on the telephone making some sort of urgent call to London. He seemed quite agitated, though he tried to hide it from me." Whimsy's monocle glinted with interest. "A telephone call, you say? How illuminating. I don't suppose you happen to overhear any portion of this conversation?" "Only fragments, my lord. Something about 20 years and the past catching up at last. But Sir Alistair was always a very private gentleman, not one to burden the servants with his personal concerns." "Quite proper," agreed Whimsy, though his tone suggested he found such discretion rather inconvenient under the present circumstances. Well then, Mrs. Pemberton, I believe I should like to examine the scene of our little drama. Lead on, if you would be so kind." As they proceeded through the house toward the library, Whimsy noted the accumulated evidence of a scholar's life. Walls lined with books in half a dozen languages, tables scattered with papers covered in scripts that would have challenged a medieval monk, the pleasant mustiness that clings to houses where learning has been pursued with more enthusiasm than profit. The library itself was a magnificent room that spoke of generations of serious reading rather than mere decoration. Inspector Parker stood near the tall windows, making notes in his methodical fashion, while the local police surgeon completed his examination of what had once been Sir Alistair Blackwood. The deceased lay slumped in a leather chair beside his desk, a service revolver of military pattern still clutched in his right hand. The wound in his chest was precise and instantly fatal, but as Parker had indicated, everything about the scene felt wrong. Too carefully arranged, too perfectly tragic. "Ah, Peter," said Parker, looking up from his notebook. "Dr. Thornley here confirms our suspicions. The angle of the wound is impossible for suicide, and the powder burns indicate the weapon was fired from at least 3 feet away." Whimsy approached the body with the detached interest he might have shown to a particularly complex chess problem. "Fascinating," he murmured, producing his magnifying glass and examining the dead man's hands with scholarly precision. No defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. Our Sir Alistair appears to have been taken entirely by surprise, though I must say, he added, straightening with a slight frown, he seems to have dressed rather formally for a quiet evening at home. Evening clothes on a Thursday. How perfectly curious. His gaze swept the room with the systematic thoroughness of a man accustomed to finding significance in the apparently insignificant. The position of the curtains, the arrangement of papers on the desk, the curious fact that one leather-bound volume on the nearest shelf protruded slightly from its fellows, all registered in that peculiar filing system that served whimsy in place of ordinary human memory. "Tell me, Mrs. Pemberton," he said suddenly, "was Sir Alistair in the habit of consulting Gibbon's Decline and Fall? Volume 4 appears to have been recently disturbed." The housekeeper looked startled. "Why, no, my lord." Sir Alistair's interests were entirely oriental. He always said that European history was merely the record of barbarians squabbling over the ruins of civilizations they were too crude to understand. "How charmingly dismissive," murmured Whimsy, carefully extracting the volume in question. As he did so, a folded paper fluttered to the floor. A telegram, he observed, dated the previous Tuesday. The message was brief but suggestive. "Arriving Thursday. Stop 20 years is long enough. Stop time to settle accounts. Stop." It bore no signature. "Well, well," said Whimsy softly, his voice carrying that note of quiet satisfaction that indicated the first piece of a complex puzzle had just revealed itself. It would appear that Sir Alistair's scholarly retirement was not quite as peaceful as it seemed. Someone, it appears, felt that 20 years was indeed quite long enough. For what, one wonders? He glanced around the room once more, noting the precise arrangement of what was clearly a carefully staged suicide. The attention to detail that spoke of both intelligence and patience. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that Sir Alistair's death would appear to be the result of his own despair. Someone who understood both the mechanics of firearms and the psychology of guilt. But they had reckoned without Lord Peter Whimsy's peculiar genius for noticing the things that didn't quite fit together. And as he stood in that quietly elegant library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries and the fresh reality of violent death, Whimsy felt the familiar stirring of intellectual excitement that meant the game was well and truly afoot. "I believe," he announced to the room at large, "that we are dealing with someone of considerable sophistication. This is not the work of a desperate amateur, but rather the carefully planned execution of a very patient and methodical individual indeed." He paused, his gaze returning to the unsigned telegram. The question, naturally, is whether our mysterious correspondent and our phantom caller are one and the same, or whether poor Sir Alister found himself caught between two very different sorts of danger on what should have been a perfectly ordinary Thursday evening. The afternoon light was beginning to fade beyond the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Turkish carpet where a scholar's blood had so recently been spilled. Somewhere in the gathering dusk, a church bell tolled the hour with that peculiar melancholy that seems to cling to English evenings like mist to a river valley. And Lord Peter Wimsey, standing amid the ruins of what had once been a peaceful retirement, smiled the thin, predatory smile of a man who has just caught the scent of a particularly challenging quarry. The telegram proved to be merely the first thread in what Wimsey suspected would prove a considerably more tangled skein than the local constabulary had bargained for. While Parker supervised the photographer's methodical documentation of the scene, Wimsey conducted his own examination with that peculiar combination of scholarly precision and predatory enthusiasm that made his investigations so distinctly unsettling to conventional minds. "Charles," he observed, holding the unsigned message to the light with the sort of reverence usually reserved for medieval manuscripts, "our correspondent possesses a rather theatrical sense of timing. 20 years is long enough. One might almost hear the dramatic pause before the curtain falls. The question, naturally, is whether we're dealing with the final act of a very long drama or merely the opening scene of something considerably more complex." Parker, who had learned to translate Wimsey's literary flourishes into practical police work, was already dispatching a constable to the telephone exchange. "We'll trace the telegram's origin, though I suspect our sender was rather too clever to leave such an obvious trail. What about that telephone call Mrs. Pemberton mentioned?" "Ah, yes, the mysterious conversation with London." Wimsey turned to the housekeeper, who had remained in the doorway with that expression of controlled distress that suggested years of practice in managing domestic crises without theatrical display. "Mrs. Pemberton, you mentioned Sir Alister seemed particularly agitated after receiving his phantom caller. Could you be more specific about the timing of events yesterday evening?" The woman's composure, which had held admirably through the discovery of murder, flickered slightly under Wimsey's gentle but persistent questioning. "Dinner was served at 7, my lord, as always." Sir Alister was most particular about punctuality, said it was a habit he'd acquired in India, where the heat made regular meals essential. He dined alone, naturally, but he always dressed formally for the evening meal. "Even on a quiet Thursday?" Wimsey's eyebrows rose with interest. "How charmingly old-fashioned. And the mysterious knock?" "At 8 o'clock precisely, my lord." 3 deliberate raps. Very formal, very purposeful. I answered the door immediately, but found only empty air and the sound of footsteps retreating rapidly down the gravel drive. She paused, her fingers worrying at her apron. "When I informed Sir Alister, he went quite pale. Said it was probably village children playing pranks, but I could see he was deeply troubled." "And the telephone call followed immediately?" "Within minutes, my lord. He shut himself in the library, and I heard him speaking urgently to someone in London. I couldn't make out the words. Sir Alister was always most considerate about not disturbing the servants with his private business, but his tone was, well, it was the voice of a man who had received very bad news indeed." Wimsey nodded thoughtfully, his gaze moving to the desk where the forced drawer gaped like a wound in the polished wood. Someone had searched Sir Alister's papers with considerable thoroughness, though the work had been done with professional care rather than desperate haste. "Tell me, Mrs. Pemberton," he continued, his voice carrying that note of casual curiosity that invariably preceded his most penetrating questions. "In your years of service here, did Sir Alister ever receive visitors of an unexpected nature? Old colleagues from his Indian years, perhaps?" For the first time, the housekeeper's carefully maintained composure cracked entirely. "There was that gentleman last month," she admitted reluctantly. Arrived without warning one afternoon. Claimed to be an old colleague from Calcutta. Sir Alister seemed quite disturbed by his visit. Sent me away on errands so they could speak privately. When I returned, the gentleman had gone and Sir Alister was different. Different in what particular way? Nervous, my lord. Started having the locks changed on all the doors, began burning his correspondence instead of simply discarding it, and he took to keeping that revolver in his desk drawer. Said it was a memento from his military service, but I'd never seen it before that gentleman's visit. Most illuminating. And this mysterious caller's appearance? A rather shabby sort of person, if you'll forgive my saying so. Medium height, dark hair going grey, perhaps 45 years of age. Very pale, as if he'd been ill. And his hands. She shuddered delicately. They shook constantly, my lord. Like a man who'd had a terrible fright and never quite recovered from it. Whimsy exchanged a meaningful glance with Parker. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly obscure. I believe, he announced, that a conversation with your gardener might prove illuminating. Where might one find this horticultural sage? Mrs. Pemberton directed him to the potting shed, and Whimsy made his way through the house's rear quarters with that air of purposeful investigation that suggested he was following a scent invisible to ordinary mortals. The gardener proved to be a sturdy fellow named Hobbs, possessed of that particular combination of rural wisdom and stubborn honesty that Whimsy had learned to value highly in witnesses. "Afternoon, my lord," Hobbs greeted him, straightening from his work among the winter cuttings. "Dreadful business about Sir Alister. Never hurt a fly, he didn't. Always treated the staff proper, not like some of the gentry." "Indeed. Mrs. Pemberton tells me you were working here yesterday afternoon." "Aye, that's right. Finished up about 5. Had to rake the gravel drive on account of the leaves making such a show of slovenliness for visitors." Hobbs paused, his weathered face creasing with thought. "Funny thing, though. This morning I found a length of scaffold plank lying amongst the laurels by the porch. One side gritted with gravel as if it had been set down and lifted again. Put it back in the shed where it belonged, but it got me thinking." Whimsy's interest sharpened considerably. "Thinking about what, precisely?" "Well, my lord, if someone wanted to cross that gravel drive without leaving footprints, a plank would do the trick nicely. Lay it down, walk across, pick it up again. Explains why there were tracks leading to the front door, but none leading away." "Most astute, Mr. Hobbs. And you noticed nothing unusual during your work yesterday?" The gardener considered this carefully. "Nothing I'd call unusual exactly. Though there was a bit of a disturbance in the herbaceous border near the old sundial. Like someone had trampled through it, but too neat for deer or dogs. And..." He hesitated, clearly debating whether to mention something that might sound foolish. "Please, Mr. Hobbs. In cases such as these, the seemingly insignificant detail often proves most significant indeed. Well, my lord, just before I left yesterday, I heard the old chapel bell chime once. That bell hasn't rung for 30 years, not since the old master passed. Gave me quite a turn, it did. Sounded lonely, like a funeral knell." Whimsy felt that familiar stirring of intellectual excitement that indicated another piece of the puzzle had just revealed itself. A chapel bell, silent for decades, chiming just before the gardener's departure. The phantom caller arriving 3 hours later. The mysterious telephone call to London, the carefully staged suicide that was clearly murder. "Most fascinating, Mr. Hobbs. This chapel, where exactly is it located?" "In the copse beyond the rose garden, my lord. Old ruin now, mostly ivy and fallen stones. But the bell towers still sound, and the bells still hanging there. Takes a strong pull to make it ring, though. Not something the wind could manage." As Whimsy made his way back to the house, his mind was already weaving the various threads into a preliminary pattern. Someone had used considerable ingenuity to create the illusion of a phantom caller, approaching across the plank to avoid leaving return footprints, possibly using the chapel bell as a signal or distraction. The mysterious visitor from the previous month had clearly been the catalyst for Sir Alister's growing anxiety, and the telegram's arrival had precipitated the final crisis. But the locked room aspect of the murder remained the most intriguing element. Returning to the library, Whimsy examined the door mechanism with his magnifying glass, noting the peculiar stiffness Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned. "Not locked from the inside, Mrs. Pemberton," he observed with that mild, almost apologetic precision that somehow managed to be more devastating than dramatic accusation. "Merely locked, and grudgingly. The mechanism has been deliberately stiffened. A few drops of wax in the works would do it nicely, to create the impression of a door that had been secured from within." He moved to the windows, noting that their inner sashes were clean where the housekeeper's diligent hand had traveled, but bore an undisturbed crescent of dust beyond the brass catches. No exit there. The soundproofing that Sir Alister had installed for his scholarly work had served his murderer's purposes admirably, ensuring that the fatal shot would not disturb the household's sleep. "Someone possessed of considerable sophistication planned this crime," Whimsy announced to the room at E. Large. "We are not dealing with a desperate amateur, but rather with someone who understood both the mechanics of murder and the psychology of investigation. They wished to create a perfect suicide, one that would satisfy both the local constabulary's desire for a tidy conclusion and any coroner's natural preference for straightforward explanations." He paused beside the fireplace, where the remains of recently burned papers created a small archaeology of anxiety. Most had been reduced to ash, but his practiced eye detected fragments of what appeared to be foreign script, not Sanskrit, but something else entirely. Perhaps Hindustani or one of the other languages Sir Alister would have encountered during his years in India. "The question that remains," Whimsy continued, his voice carrying that note of quiet satisfaction that indicated the hunt was well and truly engaged, "is whether our mysterious correspondent and our phantom caller are one and the same person, or whether poor Sir Alister found himself caught between two very different sorts of danger on what should have been a perfectly ordinary Thursday evening." The late afternoon light was beginning to fade beyond the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Turkish carpet where a scholar's blood had so recently been spilled. Somewhere in the gathering dusk, a church bell tolled the hour with that peculiar melancholy that seems to cling to English evenings like mist to a river valley. And Lord Peter Whimsy, standing amid the carefully arranged evidence of what was clearly a very sophisticated crime indeed, smiled the thin, predatory smile of a man who had just realized that his opponent was worthy of his steel. The game, as he was fond of observing, was afoot, and this particular game promised to be considerably more complex than the local authorities had bargained for. "I believe," he murmured to Parker, who was making methodical notes in his official capacity, "that we shall need to delve rather more deeply into Sir Alister's Indian years than anyone has yet attempted. 20 years may indeed have been long enough, but long enough for what, precisely, remains the essential question. And until we answer that question, I rather suspect our phantom caller will remain considerably more substantial than the local constabulary would prefer." The hour being no longer conducive to outdoor investigation, Whimsy nevertheless insisted upon examining the chapel ruins before full darkness claimed the Sussex countryside. Mrs. Pemberton provided lanterns with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing household crises, while Parker accompanied them with that expression of resigned anticipation that indicated he had long since ceased to question his friend's more eccentric investigative impulses. The copse lay shrouded in that peculiar half-light which transforms English masonry into something vaguely reproachful, as if the stones themselves bore witness to centuries of human folly. The chapel, half consumed by ivy, retained a dignity that spoke of better days, rather like a retired colonel who had pawned his sword but retained his bearing. The bell tower stood solid against the darkening sky, and beneath it the narrow arched doorway showed unmistakable signs of recent disturbance. "Observe the ivy, Charles," Whimsy murmured, his torch playing across the stone threshold. Re-looped with the clumsy care of someone hoping to erase evidence of entry, and this pale dust upon the stones. Resin, unless I'm much mistaken. The climber's friend, the violinist's necessity, the bell-ringer's essential equipment. Within the ruined chapel, the bell rope hung through a ragged opening in the ceiling, its lower portion bearing fresh marks where a loop had been tied and subsequently removed. Fresh grit scattered the flagstones beneath, suggesting a plank or board had been briefly positioned there, an echo of the gardener's mysterious plank by the front entrance. "The sequence becomes clearer," Whimsy observed, running his fingers along the rope where traces of resin provided evidence of careful preparation. Our phantom caller was no mere opportunist, but a methodical planner who required precise timing. The bell chimes at 4:30, testing whether sound carries to the house. The response is observed, the ground prepared, and the evening's drama unfolds according to a carefully orchestrated schedule. Their return to the Grange coincided with the arrival of the local constabulary's most significant development. Chief Inspector Davies, a stolid man whose enthusiasm for obvious solutions was matched only by his distrust of complicated ones, had produced what he clearly considered the case's resolution in the person of one Arthur Finch. Former civil servant? Davies announced with evident satisfaction, consulting his notes with the air of a man reading a favorable verdict. Served under Sir Alistair in India 20 years ago. Dismissed for financial irregularities. Embezzlement, though he claims it was all a misunderstanding. Been nursing a grudge ever since, by all accounts. Fits Mrs. Pemberton's description of the visitor from last month perfectly. Mr. Finch, when produced for Whimsy's inspection, proved to be a man whose life had clearly taken several unfortunate turns. His clothes were respectable but threadbare, his face bearing that particular combination of resentment and weary resignation that marked the chronically disappointed. His hands trembled with a persistent palsy that suggested either chronic anxiety or an intimate acquaintance with strong spirits. "I went to see him, yes," Finch admitted readily enough, his voice carrying the rasp of a man who had spent too many years explaining himself to unsympathetic audiences. "Wanted to clear my name, you see. 20 years I've lived under that cloud. Thought he might finally have the decency to admit his mistake, perhaps even offer some compensation for the damage he'd done." "And Sir Alistair's response?" Whimsy inquired with that deceptively mild interest that encouraged confidences. "Laughed at me," Finch replied bitterly. "Said I'd got what I deserved, that he'd forgotten all about me until I turned up like a bad penny. Threatened to call the police if I didn't leave immediately. The old devil seemed to take positive pleasure in my distress." Davies produced the unsigned telegram with a flourish. 20 years is long enough. Time to settle accounts. Rather suggestive, wouldn't you say, my lord? But Whimsy found himself more intrigued by inconsistencies than by apparent confirmations. Finch's alibi for Thursday evening, an evening of whist at an obscure London club called the Cosmopolitan Gentlemen's Social and Whist Society, was corroborated by a fellow member named Reginald Ponsonby. Yet something about the man's manner suggested fear rather than guilt, anxiety rather than the satisfaction of successful revenge. "The curious thing about perfect alibis, Charles," Whimsy observed later as they examined the library once more, "is their very perfection. Real life has a tendency toward untidiness that fabricated evidence often lacks. Mr. Finch strikes me as a man who has been genuinely frightened for some time, but not, I think, by the prospect of committing murder." It was at this juncture that the Reverend Doctor Makepeace arrived, drawn by that combination of pastoral duty and scholarly curiosity that marked the more intellectually inclined country clergy. A spare man in his 60s, He possessed that particular blend of unworldly idealism and sharp practical intelligence that made him a valuable addition to any investigation requiring local knowledge. "Dreadful business about poor Alistair," the vicar declared, accepting Mrs. Pemberton's inevitable offer of tea. Just when he was beginning to emerge from his scholarly shell, too. These past few weeks he'd been showing renewed interest in local affairs, attending evening service, asking questions about the parish records. "What sort of questions?" Parker inquired with professional interest. Dr. Makepeace hesitated, clearly torn between discretion and the desire to assist justice. He'd been examining our burial registers from the 1890s with extraordinary care. Asked rather pointed questions about the accuracy of Victorian record-keeping, whether certain irregularities might have been deliberately concealed to preserve family respectability. Whimsy felt that familiar stirring of intellectual excitement that indicated a crucial piece of information had just revealed itself. And did he find what he was seeking? "That's the curious thing," the vicar replied. He spent an entire afternoon in the vestry, but when he left, he seemed more troubled than enlightened. The sort of expression one sees on a man who has discovered something he rather wished he hadn't. The implications were as intriguing as they were ominous. Sir Alistair had been investigating something in his own family's past, something connected to the 1890s that had troubled him sufficiently to seek ecclesiastical confirmation. The mysterious caller from the previous month, the recent anxiety, the telegram threatening that 20 years is long enough, all suggested that whatever Sir Alistair had discovered in those burial registers had connected him to a danger he thought safely buried in the past. "I believe," Whimsy announced, with that quiet satisfaction that marked a successful deduction, "that we are dealing with a crime whose roots extend considerably deeper than anyone has yet suspected. Sir Alistair's murder was not the desperate act of a cornered criminal, but rather the final move in a game that has been playing out for decades." He moved to examine the library's brass fittings once more, noting the subtle but telling signs of recent manipulation. "Mrs. Pemberton, you mentioned polishing the brass yesterday." "Yes, my lord. Thursdays are for metalwork." "But not the keyhole, I observe." Whimsy's finger traced the lock mechanism, revealing a faint residue. Wax, applied with considerable care to stiffen the mechanism and create the impression of a door locked from within. The furniture of suicide, one might say, requires a certain stubborn reluctance to yield. As the evening deepened around them, Whimsy stood contemplating the accumulated evidence with that expression of focused intensity that indicated his peculiar mental machinery was processing information at considerable speed. The phantom caller who left no return footprints, the chapel bell that chimed after 30 years of silence, the carefully staged suicide that was clearly murder, the historical investigation that had troubled Sir Alistair so profoundly, all were pieces of a puzzle whose complete picture remained tantalizingly just beyond reach. "No, Charles," he said finally, his voice carrying that note of quiet certainty that indicated he had reached a preliminary conclusion. "Our Mr. Finch, for all his convenient bitterness and obvious motive, is merely the most colorful red herring in this particular pond. The real culprit is someone far more subtle, someone who understood both the mechanics of murder and the psychology of investigation well enough to provide the authorities with exactly the sort of obvious suspect they would be eager to arrest." He paused beside the window, gazing out at the darkening landscape where mist was beginning to rise from the valleys like the ghosts of old secrets. The truth lies not with the obvious motive of financial revenge, but with the subtle discrepancies that reveal a master of misdirection at work. The stiffened lock, the precise timing of the bell, the absence of return footprints, the very theatrical staging of the scene. These are the threads that lead not to Arthur Finch, but to someone far more dangerous. Someone who has been planning this particular performance for a very long time indeed. The church bell in the village tolled the hour with that melancholy persistence that seems to mark English evenings like punctuation in a particularly somber poem. And Lord Peter Wimsey, standing amid the carefully arranged evidence of what was clearly a very sophisticated crime, smiled the thin, predatory smile of a man who had just realized that his opponent was worthy of his steel, and that the game was considerably more complex than anyone had yet imagined. The morning brought with it that crystalline clarity of thought which often accompanies the aftermath of violence, and Wimsey found himself possessed of several theories that demanded immediate investigation. Bunter had arrived by the late train with his usual air of unhurried inevitability and a traveling case that appeared to contain the complete equipment of a moderately efficient field laboratory, a circumstance that proved most fortuitous when applied to the delicate archaeology of the library hearth. "The ashes tell a most instructive tale, my lord," Bunter reported with ecclesiastical gravity, displaying his careful harvest upon a sheet of white paper. Fragments of heavy paper, extensively sized, with traces of red ink ruling, ledger pages most likely. But observe this particular specimen. He indicated a brittle flake that gleamed faintly golden in the morning light. "Leaf gold, my lord. Not the genuine article, but bookbinder's ornament. And this," he touched a melted blob with fastidious precision, "scented wax, composed with Eastern perfumes. The same aromatic signature appears upon the lock mechanism and, most significantly, upon the chapel bell rope." Wimsey examined these relics with the reverence usually reserved for illuminated manuscripts. "Rosin, Bunter." "Indeed, my lord. But not merely the violinist's necessity. This particular composition includes camphor, a recipe that sets hard, grips firmly, and sheds lightly to the touch. Applied to the edge of a key, it would create an impression in a lock sufficient to, well, the possibilities are rather extensive." While Bunter continued his scientific ministrations, Wimsey turned his attention to the more subtle mysteries of domestic routine. Mrs. Pemberton, summoned for further questioning, revealed herself to be a woman whose years of service had made her an unwitting chronicler of her master's increasingly troubled state. "There's something I should have mentioned yesterday, my lord," she began, her usual composure slightly frayed at the edges. "About Sir Alister's correspondence." He'd been receiving letters. Not many, but regular-like. Always posted from London, always in the same hand, always on the 15th of each month, and always burned immediately after reading. Until recently. This last one, the one that came Tuesday, he kept it. I found it this morning, tucked inside his copy of Mills on Liberty. He always said that was the one book no Englishman should be without. The letter, when produced, proved to be written in a careful copper-plate hand that suggested education tempered by long practice in concealment. The message was tersely formal. "The arrangement has served its purpose for 20 years. Recent developments make continuation impossible. The original compact must be dissolved, regardless of consequences. Expect me Thursday evening. The matter will be settled permanently." It was signed simply M. "Most illuminating," murmured Wimsey, examining the watermark with his magnifying glass. "Harrod's finest paper. Our correspondent possesses refined tastes. But note the phrasing, Charles. This is not blackmail, but the termination of a business arrangement. Compact suggests legal or quasi-legal terminology." His seemingly casual perambulation of the house revealed further anomalies that spoke of a mind that planned extensively and left little to chance. In the drawing-room, he paused before the various timepieces that adorned the walls, noting their varying states of accuracy, with the sort of attention usually reserved for textual variants. "Tell me, Mrs. Pemberton," he inquired, examining a rather handsome French Empire clock on the library mantelpiece, "this particular timepiece, was Sir Alister in the habit of winding it regularly?" "That one was always a trial, my lord. Sir Alister insisted it kept perfect time, but it was forever losing minutes. I always suspected he wound it irregularly, though I wouldn't presume to say so." Wimsey opened the clock's small glass door and peered inside with the intensity of a scholar examining a palimpsest. "Ah," he said, a note of quiet triumph in his voice. "Not merely losing minutes, but deliberately so. The winding mechanism has been tampered with, just subtly enough to create an inconsistency in the otherwise perfect routine of a man who valued punctuality above all else." The implications were as chilling as they were illuminating. Someone intimately familiar with Sir Alister's habits had not only planned his death, but had been preparing the ground for months, perhaps years. The monthly letters from M, the gradual psychological pressure, the mechanical sabotage of familiar objects, all spoke of a campaign of intimidation that had culminated in Thursday evening's carefully orchestrated finale. Parker's return from his London inquiries brought news that cast the entire investigation in a new and considerably more sinister light. The telephone call Sir Alister had placed had indeed been to Lincoln's Inn, specifically to the firm of Smeeth and Worgan, solicitors of considerable standing who specialized in what their discreet advertisements termed delicate matters of international provenance. 8 minutes of urgent conversation, Parker reported. Mr. Worgan himself took the call. Wouldn't discuss details, naturally, but he did confirm that Sir Alister was seeking advice about what he termed historical irregularities that might prove embarrassing to the government. Worgan advised him to contact the India office immediately, which he clearly did not have the opportunity to do, Whimsy observed. How perfectly convenient for our mysterious correspondent. But the India office connection suggests something far more complex than a simple matter of smuggled antiquities. Indeed, further investigation revealed that Sir Alister had been the subject of recent official interest. A letter bearing the frank of the India office, discovered among his papers, concerned irregularities in the Bombay residency records for the year 1905 and requested his immediate attendance in London for clarification of certain discrepancies. The picture that emerged was both clearer and more complex than Chief Inspector Davis's simple theory of revenge. Sir Alister had been conducting a profitable trade in Oriental manuscripts, quite possibly items that had found their way into his possession through means that would not bear official scrutiny. The monthly letters from M suggested a long-standing partnership in this scholarly smuggling operation, an arrangement that had suddenly become untenable when the India office began investigating 20-year-old irregularities. "Consider the psychology of our murderer, Charles," Whimsy observed as they stood once more in the violated sanctuary of the library. "This is not the work of a desperate amateur, but rather the calculated execution of someone who understood both the mechanics of murder and the psychology of investigation. The rosin on the bell rope, the curtain cords, the lock mechanism. Our phantom caller left his chemical signature throughout the house like a violinist tuning his instrument before a performance. He moved to examine the sideboard where Bunter had discovered the telltale circular mark in the dust. And here we have the missing salver, removed not for theft, but for its acoustic properties. Silver conducts sound poorly, Charles. Placed strategically, it could muffle the report of a firearm most effectively, particularly in a room already soundproofed against the cries of rooks. The accumulated evidence painted a portrait of methodical preparation that had begun months, perhaps years, before Thursday evening's climax. The mysterious M had not merely killed Sir Alister. He had orchestrated an elaborate performance designed to satisfy the authorities' preference for obvious solutions while concealing the true complexity of the crime. 20 years is indeed long enough, Whimsy murmured, his gaze returning to the unsigned letter that had precipitated the final act. Long enough for a partnership to sour, for official investigation to threaten exposure, for old secrets to demand new silences. Our Mr. Finch, for all his convenient bitterness, is merely the most colorful red herring in a pond that conceals considerably more dangerous fish. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the Turkish carpet where a scholar's blood had been so carefully spilled, Whimsy found himself contemplating the curious psychology of crimes that span decades. Somewhere in the labyrinth of Sir Alister's past, a secret had been buried that someone had finally decided was too dangerous to remain hidden. The stranger who knocked on Thursday had come not as a phantom, but as an executioner, and the game, Whimsy reflected with that thin smile that had alarmed criminals across 3 continents, was far from over. The next move belonged to him, and he intended to make it count. "Come, Charles," he announced, reaching for his hat with the languid enthusiasm that indicated the hunt was well and truly engaged. "We have a mysterious M to unmask, a missing salver to locate, and a 20-year-old crime to resurrect. The dead, as any classical scholar will tell you, have a most inconvenient habit of refusing to stay properly buried." The London expedition proved as illuminating as it was circuitous, for Whimsy had learned long ago that the most significant discoveries often emerged from conversations that appeared entirely tangential to the matter at hand. Mr. Worgan of Smeeth and Worgan, being of that species of solicitor who knows the weight of words to the drachm, admitted as much as his conscience and his retainer permitted. "Sir Alister consulted me regarding a matter touching both private honour and public inconvenience," he said, weighing each syllable with judicial precision. "He believed that a certain arrangement made in the first decade of this century, an arrangement to which he was party, had become insupportable under present scrutiny. He wished to dissolve it without doing injury to persons not otherwise implicated." "And the arrangement's other party?" inquired Whimsy idly, examining a bronze of Justinian whose finger had been polished by generations of uneasy clients. "My lord, you appreciate that names are the private property of their owners. I can say that for 20 years a monthly remittance has been paid from a trust established when Sir Alister returned from India, originally to secure silence about certain acquisitions which, though of scholarly value, were acquired in a manner unsuited to the bright light of official inspection. The beneficiary is designated by an initial only." "M," said Whimsy, as if remarking on the weather. "The trust is suspended pending instructions that will now, I presume, be moot. Sir Alister telephoned me Thursday evening. He used the phrase, 'the past coming due.' I advised him that such pasts often respond better to daylight than to checks." The India office proved equally illuminating, though in ways that cast the entire investigation in a more sinister light. An under-secretary with a mind like iron filings under silk permitted Parker to read a paragraph and infer 3 more. A ledger at the Bombay Residency, 1905, bore annotations attributed to Sir Alister. An inventory of manuscripts did not correspond precisely to the items present when the governor's seal was affixed. Later sales in Europe, made under a dealer's name modestly veiling a learned gentleman, suggested a private stream of scholarly revenue. "And the danger?" asked Parker. "An imputation of dishonour where it would be most unwelcome," said the Under-Secretary delicately, "and a suggestion, purely inchoate, that certain complaints might be found to have more substance than was at the time convenient." Back at the Grange by late afternoon, Whimsy devoted himself to what he termed the archaeology of deception. The immediate aftermath of Sir Alister's demise, as presented by Chief Inspector Davies, was a picture of tragic simplicity. But Whimsy, with his peculiar aversion to tidy conclusions, found himself increasingly intrigued by the very neatness of the package. "Bunter," he announced, examining the French Empire clock on the mantelpiece with a jeweller's loupe. "Our murderer is a connoisseur of time. He understands its elasticity, its capacity for manipulation." He pointed to the clock's internal mechanism, a subtle adjustment to the escapement. Not enough to stop the clock, merely to make it run consistently slow. How very clever! A clock that loses time can be used to gain time if one knows its precise rate of error. The implications were staggering. The phantom knock at 8 o'clock had occurred by the hall clock, which Mrs. Pemberton had always known ran fast. The actual time would have been approximately 7:51, creating a crucial 9-minute window that had been carefully calculated into the evening's deadly choreography. The timing of events here is altogether too precise, Charles. Whimsy continued, his voice carrying that note of intellectual excitement that indicated a significant breakthrough. Our murderer possesses a theatrical director's eye for the dramatic pause and the well-placed cue. But the details, the tiny, seemingly irrelevant details, betray his true purpose. Bunter's systematic examination of the library had revealed further evidence of methodical preparation. The missing salver, discovered in the linen press beneath a pile of antimacassars, bore minute pitting and a crescent of soot consistent with having received a violent impact from hot gases at close range. The soundproofing that Sir Alister had installed for his scholarly work had served his murderer's purposes admirably, but the killer had taken additional precautions to muffle the fatal shot. "The sequence becomes clearer," Whimsy observed, running his fingers along the curtain cord where traces of the same aromatic wax provided evidence of careful preparation. Our phantom caller was no mere opportunist, but a methodical planner who required precise timing. The chapel bell chimes at 4:30, testing whether sound carries to the house. The response is observed, the ground prepared, and the evening's drama unfolds according to a carefully orchestrated schedule. The locked room aspect of the murder proved equally ingenious upon closer examination. The wax in the lock mechanism had not merely stiffened the key, it had created the perfect illusion of a door secured from within, while actually allowing manipulation from the corridor. A thin implement inserted from the outside, combined with a deliberately stiffened mechanism, would create exactly the sort of stubborn resistance Mrs. Pemberton had encountered. "Someone possessed of considerable sophistication planned this crime," Whimsy announced to the room at large. "We are not dealing with a desperate amateur, but rather with someone who understood both the mechanics of murder and the psychology of investigation. They wished to create a perfect suicide, one that would satisfy both the local constabulary's desire for a tidy conclusion and any coroner's natural preference for straightforward explanations." As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Whimsy found himself contemplating the curious psychology of crimes that span decades. The monthly payments to M, the recent anxiety about official investigation, the careful staging of Thursday evening's events, all spoke of a conspiracy that had been maintained for 20 years and was now being terminated with permanent finality. "I believe," he murmured to Parker, "that we are dealing with a crime whose roots extend considerably deeper than anyone has yet suspected. Sir Alister's murder was not the desperate act of a cornered criminal, but rather the final move in a game that has been playing out for decades." The church bell in the village tolled the hour, with that melancholy persistence that seems to mark English evenings like punctuation in a particularly somber poem. Somewhere in the gathering dusk, a secret that had been buried for 20 years was stirring in its grave, and Lord Peter Whimsy, standing amid the carefully arranged evidence of what was clearly a very sophisticated crime indeed, smiled the thin, predatory smile of a man who had just realized that his opponent was worthy of his steel. "Tonight, Charles," he announced with that quiet satisfaction that marked a successful deduction, "we shall test the chronology. The gods are in the movement of the hands, and we must be precise if we are to untangle a murder that has been 20 years in the making and 2 hours in the doing." The game, as he was fond of observing, was well and truly afoot, and this particular game promised to be considerably more complex than the local authorities had bargained for. The testing of the chronology began with that methodical precision which Whimsy brought to all enterprises requiring the dissection of human folly. Mrs. Pemberton, summoned once more to replay Thursday evening's tragedy, found herself caught between bewilderment and professional duty as Whimsy positioned himself in the library with a stopwatch of Swiss manufacture and that expression of concentrated attention which indicated his peculiar mental machinery was operating at full capacity. "The beauty of chronology, Mrs. Pemberton," he observed, settling himself in the chair where Sir Alister had met his carefully orchestrated demise, "lies in its stubborn refusal to accommodate human convenience. time is the one witness that cannot be bribed, threatened, or confused, though it can, with sufficient ingenuity, be made to appear to contradict itself. The reconstruction proceeded with theatrical precision. At Whimsy's direction, Mrs. Pemberton positioned herself in the kitchen exactly as she had been at 8 o'clock Thursday evening, then proceeded to the front door upon hearing Bunter's reproduction of the mysterious 3 knocks. The timing proved instructive, 17 seconds from kitchen to front entrance, allowing for her natural pace and the slight delay occasioned by drying her hands upon her apron. 43 seconds total, Whimsy announced with satisfaction, and during those 43 seconds, our phantom caller would have had ample opportunity to complete his vanishing act, provided, of course, that he possessed both intimate knowledge of the house's acoustic properties and access to certain mechanical advantages. But it was the investigation of the hall clock's peculiar behavior that yielded the evening's most significant revelation. The timepiece, which Mrs. Pemberton had always known to run fast, proved upon examination to maintain a consistent 9-minute advance over Greenwich time. This seemingly trivial domestic inconvenience transformed the entire chronology of Thursday evening's events. "Consider the implications, Charles," Whimsy continued, his voice carrying that note of quiet triumph that marked a successful deduction. The mysterious knock occurred at 8 o'clock by the hall clock, but the actual time was 7:51. This creates a crucial 9-minute window during which the house was effectively unobserved, Mrs. Pemberton being occupied with her kitchen duties. The chapel bell's role in the evening's drama became clearer through practical experiment. Bunter, dispatched to the ruins with instructions to recreate the gardener's mysterious chime, confirmed that a single toll would carry clearly to the house, while the ringer remained concealed within the ivy-shrouded tower. More significantly, the sound would mask the approach of footsteps on gravel for precisely the duration required to cross from the chapel to the house's rear quarters. "The sequence becomes irresistibly clear," Whimsy continued, leading Parker through the darkening gardens toward the library's tall windows. Our phantom caller never approached the front door at all. The mysterious knock was a carefully orchestrated deception designed to draw Mrs. Pemberton's attention while the real approach was made elsewhere. It was at the library windows that Whimsy's theory found its most compelling confirmation. The inner sashes bore the expected film of dust where Mrs. Pemberton's diligent cleaning had not reached, but examination of the exterior revealed subtle but telling signs of recent disturbance, faint smudges on the window frame and a barely perceptible scuff mark on the stone sill below. "Observe the curtain cords, Charles," Whimsy instructed, indicating a subtle fraying in the heavy velvet rope. Not the smooth wear of regular use, but the rough scoring of recent manipulation. Our murderer did not vanish into thin air. He simply knew a more imaginative route of departure. The implications were as elegant as they were chilling. The killer had entered through the library window, which he then secured from within before confronting Sir Alistair. After committing the murder and staging the suicide scene, he had departed through the same window, leaving no footprints on the gravel drive and creating the perfect illusion of a phantom visitor who had materialized and vanished without trace. But it was Bunter's discovery in the scullery that provided the most damning physical evidence. A rubberized apron, recently scrubbed with unusual thoroughness, had been reinforced at the shoulders with waxed thread, the same aromatic compound found on the lock mechanism and chapel bell rope. The apron, when positioned on the library carpet, covered precisely the area where microscopic blood spatter would have settled from a close-range gunshot. "I washed the mops last thing of an evening," Mrs. Pemberton protested when confronted with this domestic treachery. "But I didn't scrub that thing, my lord." "It wasn't in the sink at 10 o'clock when I turned down the lamps." "Then someone else scrubbed it between 10 and dawn," Parker observed grimly, "and replaced it with a conscientiousness that is almost touching. Our murderer tidies up after himself." The accumulated evidence painted a portrait of methodical preparation that had begun long before Thursday evening's climax. The monthly letters from M, The gradual psychological pressure, the mechanical sabotage of familiar objects, all spoke of a campaign of intimidation that had culminated in murder when Sir Alister's official troubles made continued silence impossible. 20 years of careful arrangement, Whimsy mused as they returned to the house through gardens that seemed to whisper of old secrets in the darkness. 20 years of mutual benefit and mutual fear. But when official investigation threatened exposure, our mysterious M decided that permanent silence was preferable to continued risk. The locked room aspect of the murder proved equally ingenious upon closer examination. The wax in the lock mechanism had not merely stiffened the key, it had created the perfect illusion of a door secured from within, while actually allowing manipulation from the corridor. A skilled hand, working from outside, could create exactly the sort of stubborn resistance Mrs. Pemberton had encountered when she discovered the body. Someone possessed of considerable sophistication planned this crime, Whimsy announced to the assembled company. We are not dealing with a desperate amateur, but rather with someone who understood both the mechanics of murder and the psychology of investigation. They wished to create a perfect suicide, one that would satisfy both the local constabulary's desire for a tidy conclusion and any coroner's natural preference for straightforward explanations. As the evening deepened around them, Whimsy stood contemplating the accumulated evidence with that expression of focused intensity that indicated his peculiar mental machinery was processing information at considerable speed. The phantom caller who left no return footprints, the chapel bell that chimed after 30 years of silence, the carefully staged suicide that was clearly murder, all were pieces of a puzzle whose complete picture was finally beginning to emerge. But our murderer's very sophistication may prove his undoing, Whimsy observed with that thin smile that had alarmed criminals across 3 continents. He has been too clever, too careful, too concerned with creating the perfect illusion. And perfect illusions, like perfect alibis, have a tendency to reveal their artificial nature under sufficiently intense scrutiny. The church bell in the village tolled the hour, with that melancholy persistence that seems to mark English evenings like punctuation in a particularly somber poem. And Lord Peter Whimsy, standing amid the carefully arranged evidence of what was clearly a very sophisticated crime indeed, began to formulate the trap that would finally unmask the stranger who had knocked on Thursday, not as a phantom, but as a very real and very dangerous adversary whose 20-year game of shadows was about to end in the unforgiving light of justice. "Tomorrow, Charles," he announced, "we shall discover whether our mysterious M is quite as clever as he believes himself to be. For I suspect that a mind capable of such elaborate deception cannot resist the temptation to return and admire his handiwork, and when he does, we shall be waiting." The morning brought revelations that transformed the entire complexion of the case, though Whimsy received them with that air of languid satisfaction which suggested he had been expecting precisely such developments. Dr. Makepeace arrived before breakfast with a collection of parish documents that cast Sir Alister's recent antiquarian researches in a considerably more sinister light, while Bunter's methodical examination of the previous evening's evidence yielded physical confirmations that spoke more eloquently than any confession. "The beauty of parish records, Charles," Whimsy observed, spreading the vicar's documents across the library desk with the reverence usually reserved for illuminated manuscripts, "lies in their stubborn adherence to fact, however inconvenient that fact may prove to the families concerned. Victorian clergymen possessed an admirable indifference to social embarrassment when eternal souls were at stake. The burial register for 1895 contained an entry that had clearly troubled Sir Alister's scholarly conscience. One Margaret Blackwood, aged 22, recorded as deceased in Bombay but subsequently amended, with considerable skill but obvious reluctance, to indicate interment in the family plot. The alteration had been made in different ink, by a different hand, and bore all the hallmarks of a deliberate falsification designed to accommodate an inconvenient truth. Sir Alister's younger sister, Dr. Makepeace explained, his finger tracing the suspect entry. The family always maintained she died of fever in India, but the original record clearly states Bombay, while the amendment claims local burial. Most irregular and the sort of discrepancy that would trouble any scholar's conscience. But it was Bunter's discoveries from the previous evening's adventure that provided the most significant breakthrough. The mysterious intruder had indeed left traces. Not merely the violet stain from the treated window latch, but something far more revealing. A small leather notebook, dropped in the confusion of flight, contained entries in the same careful copperplate hand that had signed the monthly trust receipts as M. "Observe the entries, my lord," Bunter reported with ecclesiastical gravity. "Dates, amounts, and locations, a meticulous record of 20 years' worth of clandestine meetings. But note this particular sequence. January 15th, usual place, usual sum. A. Increasingly nervous about official inquiries. February 15th. A. Threatens to confess all unless arrangement terminated. March 15th. Final payment. Matter must be resolved permanently." The notebook's revelations painted a portrait of a relationship that had evolved from mutual benefit to desperate coercion. The mysterious M was not merely a blackmailer, but someone whose very existence depended upon Sir Alister's continued silence. The monthly payments had not been extortion, but the price of maintaining a fiction that protected both parties until official investigation made that fiction untenable. 20 years of careful arrangement, Whimsy mused, his pale eyes fixed upon the damning evidence. 20 years of mutual dependence disguised as mutual exploitation. But when the India office began investigating irregularities in the Bombay records, our mysterious correspondent realized that exposure would destroy not merely Sir Alister's reputation, but their own carefully constructed existence. Parker's return from London brought confirmation of Whimsy's growing suspicions. The trust established by Colonel Aubrey Montrose had indeed been designed to maintain someone in comfortable obscurity, but the beneficiary was not what anyone had expected. The monthly payments had been collected not by a man, but by a woman who had been officially dead for 20 years, but who had been living quietly in a series of respectable lodging houses under the name of Mary Montrose. "The Colonel's ward," Parker reported, consulting his notes with professional precision. "Orphaned in India as a child, brought back to England for her education, then supposedly died of consumption in 1895. But the death certificate was signed by a doctor who had been struck off the medical register for falsifying documents, and the burial was conducted by a clergyman who left the country immediately afterward under rather mysterious circumstances. The implications were as elegant as they were chilling. Margaret Blackwood had not died in 1895. She had been transformed into Mary Montrose, given a new identity and a monthly income in exchange for her permanent disappearance from respectable society. But what scandal could have been so damaging as to require such elaborate deception? It was Mrs. Pemberton who provided the final piece of the puzzle, her voice barely above a whisper as she recounted village gossip that had never quite died. "There were stories about Miss Margaret, my lord. Terrible stories about what happened to some of the village children when she was about. The family hushed it up naturally, but people remembered. They said she wasn't quite right in her mind, that she had unnatural appetites." The Gothic horror that had seemed to lurk at the edges of the case suddenly revealed itself as psychological rather than supernatural. Margaret Blackwood had been dangerous, not in any mystical sense, but in the most practical and terrifying way imaginable. Her supposed death had been a mercy to both society and herself, allowing her to disappear before her condition could destroy more innocent lives. The arrangement was not merely about family honor, Whimsy observed, his voice carrying that note of quiet certainty that marked a successful deduction. It was about public safety. Sir Alister and Colonel Montrose conspired to remove a dangerous individual from society while preserving the fiction that she had died of natural causes. The monthly payments were not blackmail, but the price of maintaining a humane solution to an inhuman problem. But the India Office investigation had threatened to expose not merely the manuscript smuggling, but the entire elaborate fiction of Margaret's death. Official scrutiny of the Bombay records would inevitably lead to questions about other irregularities, other convenient deaths, other arrangements that would not bear the bright light of bureaucratic examination. She came here Thursday evening not as a blackmailer, Whimsy continued, but as someone whose very existence was about to be exposed. The telegram threatening that 20 years is long enough was not an ultimatum, but a desperate plea from someone who realized that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to be destroyed. The locked room murder, the phantom, caller, the elaborate staging, all had been designed to create the perfect suicide while eliminating the one person who could expose a secret that had been buried for 2 decades. Margaret Blackwood, the woman who had been officially dead since 1895, had killed her brother to preserve the fiction that had kept her both alive and safely hidden from a world that would never understand the mercy of her exile. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the library carpet, Whimsy found himself contemplating the curious psychology of crimes that span generations. The stranger who had knocked on Thursday had come not as a phantom, but as a ghost made flesh, someone whose very existence was a contradiction that could only be resolved through violence. "The question that remains," he announced to Parker, who was making methodical notes in his official capacity, "is not whether we can prove Margaret Blackwood's guilt. The evidence is overwhelming, but whether we can locate a woman who has spent 20 years perfecting the art of invisibility. She has had 2 decades to prepare for this eventuality, and I suspect she will not be found unless she chooses to be found." The church bell in the village tolled the hour with that melancholy persistence that seems to mark English evenings like punctuation in a particularly somber poem. And Lord Peter Whimsy, standing amid the carefully arranged evidence of what was clearly the most psychologically complex crime of his career, smiled the thin, predatory smile of a man who had just realized that his opponent was not merely worthy of his steel, but had been playing a game whose rules he was only beginning to understand. "Tomorrow, Charles," he announced with that quiet satisfaction that marked a successful deduction, "we shall discover whether a woman who has been dead for 20 years can be persuaded to surrender to justice, or whether she will choose to make her fictional death a permanent reality." The game, as he was fond of observing, was approaching its most dangerous phase, the moment when a cornered criminal must choose between capture and a final, desperate gambit that would settle all accounts permanently. The pursuit of a woman who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of invisibility required methods that conventional police work had never contemplated, and Whimsy found himself drawing upon resources that would have astonished Chief Inspector Davies had he been privy to their existence. The leather notebook discovered during the previous evening's adventure had yielded a treasure trove of information that painted Margaret Blackwood's careful existence in stark, methodical detail. "The beauty of sustained deception, Charles," Whimsy observed as Bunter presented his analysis of the notebook's contents, "lies in its very consistency. Observe these entries, 20 years of meticulous record-keeping, each payment marked by the 15th, each location coded with initials more careful than cryptic. HR in spring, LI in midsummer, CG recurring as regularly as Michaelmas rent. Our Lady has been nothing if not systematic in her arrangements." Bunter's forensic examination had revealed additional details that spoke eloquently of Margaret's professional approach to concealment. The wax composition found throughout the house, on the lock mechanism, the chapel bell rope, and now confirmed in the notebook's binding, contained camphor and rosin in proportions that suggested pharmaceutical knowledge. More tellingly, the paper itself bore a watermark from Harrod's finest stationery, indicating that Margaret's economies lay in lodging and letters, while her vanities extended to shoes and writing materials. The network of theatrical landladies and discreet boarding house proprietresses that Bunter had cultivated during his years of service proved invaluable in tracking someone who had made respectability her camouflage. Within hours, they had located Margaret's recent residence, a respectable lodging house in Bloomsbury, where she had lived as Mary Montrose, the widow of a colonial administrator, supporting herself through the translation of Oriental manuscripts. Mrs. Hartwell, the proprietress, proved to be a woman of that particular combination of discretion and observation that marked the successful keeper of genteel secrets. Miss Montrose was always most particular about her privacy, she reported with careful precision. Kept very regular hours, received correspondence through a postal accommodation address, never entertained visitors. But these past few weeks she'd been quite agitated, pacing about at all hours, burning papers despite the mild weather. On Wednesday she asked whether the police had made any inquiries about her, and when I assured her they had not, she seemed almost disappointed. The abandoned lodgings told a more chilling story. The rooms had been systematically stripped, but the fireplace contained remnants of what Bunter's patient archaeology revealed to be correspondence, travel documents, and, most significantly, a detailed floor plan of Blackwood Grange annotated with sight lines, acoustic properties, and timing calculations. "She has been planning this for months," Whimsy observed, examining the charred fragments. "Not merely the murder itself, but the complete elimination of Mary Montrose's existence. She intends to vanish as thoroughly as Margaret Blackwood did 20 years ago." It was Dr. Makepeace who provided the most disturbing revelation, arriving with additional parish records that cast Margaret's original exile in a far more sinister light. "Further examination has revealed a most troubling pattern," the vicar reported gravely. "Margaret Blackwood was not the only young person whose death was recorded with suspicious circumstances during the 1890s. 3 village children died of sudden fever during her residence at the Grange, all attended by the same doctor, Cornelius Marsh, whose license was subsequently revoked. The implications were staggering. Margaret's supposed death had not merely preserved family honor, it had prevented further murders. The arrangement that sustained her had been protective custody disguised as financial support, keeping a dangerous individual safely isolated from potential victims. "She is not fleeing justice, Charles," Whimsy announced with dawning horror. "She is seeking to complete what she began. The India Office investigation threatens to expose not merely manuscript smuggling, but the real reason for her exile. Once that truth emerges, her carefully maintained anonymity becomes impossible." But rather than pursue Margaret through London's labyrinth, Whimsy chose a more subtle approach. He understood that the greatest fear of the truly hidden was not discovery itself, but the manner of discovery, to be dragged into light as a sensational footnote rather than disappearing on one's own terms. "We shall make it known," he explained to Parker, "that Sir Alister's entire archive is to be catalogued and possibly published, his journals, correspondence, financial records, all laid bare for scholarly scrutiny. The very thought will summon her more effectively than any warrant." The trap was psychological rather than physical. A carefully worded leak to the local press hinted at forthcoming official inquiry into Sir Alister's private papers, suggesting the India Office's particular interest in anomalous records requiring clarification. Margaret would have to return to destroy or retrieve whatever might betray her. As evening approached, Whimsy arranged the library like a stage set. Sir Alister's papers were displayed in artful disarray, with particularly sensitive-looking documents, blank pages and innocuous letters, in reality, prominently visible. The French Empire clock continued its deceptive rhythm, while Bunter positioned himself with that supernatural quietness that made him invaluable in such enterprises. "The psychology of the criminal, Charles," Whimsy observed as twilight gathered, "is often predictable. They return, not from morbid fascination, but from profound need to complete the narrative, to ensure no loose ends remain." The vigil stretched through the evening hours, the Grange settling into that profound stillness that transforms familiar spaces into something expectant and strange. Whimsy sat in Sir Alister's chair, apparently reading, though his pale eyes missed nothing. Every creak, every rustle was noted and catalogued. "Patience, Charles," he murmured to Parker's growing restlessness. "Our quarry is a creature of shadows. She will move only when she believes the moment propitious, when the house appears lulled into false security." The silence stretched taut as a violin string. Then, from beyond the rose garden, came the faintest disturbance. Ivy brushed by a careful hand, the whisper of fabric against stone. Whimsy's fingers moved to the silver whistle in his waistcoat pocket. The theatrical reveal was about to begin, and with it, the final confrontation between Lord Peter Whimsy and a woman who had been officially dead for 20 years, but whose capacity for violence had never been more terrifyingly alive. Through the library window, a shadow deeper than shadow began to take shape, moving with the practiced certainty of someone who had rehearsed this approach many times before. Margaret Blackwood, the stranger who had knocked on Thursday, was returning to complete her deadly work. But this time, Lord Peter Whimsy would be waiting with a trap as carefully constructed as any she had ever devised. The shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness beyond the window, resolving into a figure of such studied ordinariness that Whimsy felt a momentary appreciation for the artistry involved. Margaret Blackwood had perfected the camouflage of respectability, a woman of middle years whose careful posture and unremarkable dress spoke of genteel poverty rather than homicidal sophistication. Only her hands, pale and restless in the moonlight, betrayed the tension that drove her back to complete what Thursday evening had begun. She worked at the window latch with practiced efficiency, her fingers applying that same aromatic wax compound whose chemical signature had betrayed her throughout the house. The mechanism yielded with barely a whisper, and she slipped into the library with fluid grace, not the nervous flutter of a cornered animal, but the purposeful movement of a predator returning to familiar hunting grounds. Whimsy remained motionless in Sir Alister's chair, his breathing carefully regulated to suggest scholarly drowsiness rather than watchful anticipation. Through half-closed eyes, he observed Margaret's systematic approach to the desk, her movements betraying an intimacy with the room's contents that spoke of previous nocturnal visits. She was seeking something specific, not merely destroying evidence, but retrieving what had been hidden with such care that even Thursday's murderous business had not provided opportunity for its recovery. Her fingers found the leather portfolio concealed behind the loose brick that Whimsy's investigation had revealed, and for the first time her composure showed a hairline crack of satisfaction. Whatever secrets that portfolio contained had been worth risking everything to reclaim. "Looking for something in particular, Miss Blackwood?" Whimsy's voice carried that note of mild curiosity which had so often preceded his most devastating revelations. Though I suppose, after 20 years of aliases, the question of which name responds to conscience becomes rather academic. Margaret's reaction was immediate and professional. No theatrical start or feminine shriek, but the swift calculation of someone accustomed to danger. Her assessment of the room's altered dynamics was as methodical as her brother's murder had been, her pale eyes cataloguing exits and obstacles with the efficiency of long practice. "Lord Peter Whimsy," she replied, her voice carrying that peculiar flatness which marked those who had learned to live without the luxury of genuine emotion. "I had rather hoped to conclude this business without the necessity of explanations." "Explanations, my dear lady, are precisely what this business has lacked from the beginning." Whimsy rose from his chair with languid grace, his pale eyes fixed upon the portfolio that clearly contained whatever had made Thursday's elaborate performance necessary. The phantom caller, the locked room that wasn't locked, the suicide that was clearly murder, all very theatrical, but rather lacking in that quality of human truth which makes the best dramas memorable. From the shadows, Parker emerged with that methodical inevitability which marked Scotland Yard at its most efficient, while Bunter materialized with his supernatural quietness. Margaret noted their presence without alarm, her attention focused entirely upon Whimsy with the sort of professional assessment that suggested she was calculating odds rather than contemplating surrender. "You understand nothing of the necessities that created this arrangement," she said, clutching the portfolio with desperate intensity. "Nothing of the choices that decent people were forced to make when confronted with irregularities that could not be publicly acknowledged. I understand that 3 children died in this village during your residence here," Whimsy replied, his voice carrying steel beneath its conversational tone. "I understand that your brother and Colonel Montrose conspired to fake your death rather than see you face justice for those murders. And I understand that 20 years of comfortable exile was insufficient compensation for the inconvenience of your continued existence." For the first time, Margaret's mask of respectability slipped entirely, revealing the dangerous creature beneath. "Those children were unfortunate accidents. I was ill, not responsible for my actions. The arrangement was merciful to everyone concerned. Merciful to you, certainly. Less so to the families who never learned why their children sickened and died." Whimsy's tone remained conversational, but his words cut with surgical precision. "But Thursday evening's business was no accident, was it? That was the calculated execution of a man who had protected you for 20 years. The portfolio trembled in her grasp as she spoke with terrible clarity. "Alistair was prepared to confess everything to the India office. 20 years of mutual protection, and he would have destroyed it all to preserve his reputation for scholarly integrity. He chose his precious academic honor over my survival. So you chose his death over your exposure. The staging was quite masterful. The stiffened lock, the rosin on the bell rope, the precisely timed phantom knock, the missing salver to muffle the shot. Even the deliberately mistimed clock to provide your crucial 9-minute window. A virtuoso performance in every particular." Whimsy moved closer, his voice dropping to that quiet intensity which marked his most serious moments. But virtuoso performances, like perfect alibis, have a tendency to reveal their artificial nature under sufficiently close scrutiny. The violet stain on your gloves from Bunter's treated window latch, the camphor-scented wax that marks every surface you touched, the unusual wear on the curtain cords where you tested their strength. These small, eloquent details tell a story you preferred to keep silent. Margaret's composure finally cracked entirely, her voice rising with desperate justification. "You cannot comprehend the burden of living with such knowledge, such appetites. The monthly payments were never blackmail. They were compensation for a life lived in shadow so that others might sleep peacefully in the light. But when official investigation threatened exposure, what choice did I have?" "The same choice your brother made 20 years ago," Whimsy replied with unexpected gentleness. "The choice to trust in mercy rather than violence, in human compassion rather than elaborate deception. He protected you then, even knowing what you were. He deserved better than a bullet in the heart for his trouble." The leather portfolio slipped from her fingers as she seemed to deflate, the rigid control that had sustained her for 2 decades finally giving way. "The arrangement is concluded," she said with terrible finality. "Margaret Blackwood died in 1895, and Mary Montrose dies tonight. Some stories, Lord Peter, are better left unfinished." But Whimsy had anticipated this final gambit, and his whistle brought not merely Parker's official authority, but Dr. Thornley with his medical bag. The woman who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of disappearance would not be permitted to vanish into death as easily as she had vanished into exile. "No, Miss Blackwood," Whimsy said firmly as Parker moved forward with professional restraint. "This story will have its proper ending in a courtroom with judge and jury, where truth may finally serve justice rather than convenience. The dead have waited 20 years for their accounting. They shall have it at last. As Margaret Blackwood was led away, not to the grave she had chosen, but to the justice she had so long evaded, the French Empire clock chimed the hour with its characteristic irregularity. Time, Whimsy reflected, was indeed the one witness that could not be bribed or threatened. And time, in the end, had proven his most reliable ally in unmasking the stranger who had knocked on Thursday. The library settled into silence, its violated sanctuary finally at peace. The game was over, the players dispersed, and Lord Peter Wimsey stood alone among the carefully arranged evidence of human folly, contemplating the curious psychology of those who believe, themselves beyond the reach of consequence. Some secrets, he mused, were indeed better buried, but not at the cost of innocent blood, and never at the expense of justice long delayed. "Come, Charles," he said finally, reaching for his hat. "We have reports to write and explanations to provide. The Crown shall have its tidy narrative, but it shall be built upon truth rather than convenient fiction. There is a difference, and it matters more than the bureaucrats will ever understand." The hours that followed Margaret Blackwood's capture possessed that peculiar quality of anticlimax, which invariably accompanies the resolution of elaborate deceptions. Parker supervised the formal procedures with his usual methodical efficiency, while Dr. Thornley administered a mild sedative to prevent any final dramatic gestures. Margaret submitted to custody with the weary resignation of someone whose carefully maintained performance had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. The leather portfolio that had driven her to such desperate measures proved to contain the complete archaeology of 20 years' worth of sustained deception. Letters between Sir Alister and Colonel Montrose detailed the careful construction of Margaret's new identity, including forged death certificates and burial records that would satisfy any casual inquiry. More chilling were Sir Alister's private journals, which recorded his growing unease with the monthly payments and his horrified discovery of the true circumstances surrounding the village children's deaths in the 1890s. The arrangement was never simple blackmail, Whimsy observed, examining the meticulously preserved correspondence. It was protective custody disguised as financial support, a conspiracy of mercy that became a prison of mutual dependence. When the India Office investigation threatened exposure, Margaret realized that her carefully constructed exile was about to collapse entirely. Most damning of all was Margaret's own notebook, which revealed the extent of her preparation for Thursday evening's deadly performance. Floor plans of the Grange marked with sight lines and timing calculations, recipes for the aromatic wax compound that had betrayed her throughout the house, and detailed observations of household routines that had enabled her phantom caller deception. Even a note to procure plank from shed before dusk demonstrated the methodical nature of her approach. Arthur Finch, summoned from his London lodgings with the expectation of formal charges, found himself instead the recipient of official apologies. Margaret's notebook contained pages specifically designed to implicate him, complete with forged correspondence suggesting he had been pressuring Sir Alister for financial restitution. The red herring had been as carefully constructed as every other aspect of her elaborate performance. "I suppose I ought to be grateful," Finch said bleakly when presented with evidence of his manipulation. "Gratitude is a luxury, like vintage port," Whimsy replied with characteristic precision. "Do not force it. Go home, Mr. Finch. Try honesty. It requires considerably less rehearsal than sustained deception." The trial that followed became a sensation that the popular press dubbed the case of the living ghost. Margaret's defense counsel attempted to argue diminished responsibility, but the methodical preparation revealed by Whimsy's investigation made such claims untenable. The jury required less than an hour to return a verdict of guilty, and the judge's sentence carried the weight of justice too long delayed. The beauty of a truly clever crime, Whimsy explained to Parker as they reviewed the case files, lies not in its complexity, but in its apparent simplicity. Margaret provided us with a suicide, neatly packaged and designed to satisfy the most cursory inquiry. The phantom knock at 8 o'clock, actually 7:51 by the deliberately fast hall clock, created her crucial window of opportunity. The chapel bell, silent for 30 years, served both as psychological torment for Sir Alistair and acoustic cover for her approach. The missing salver muffled the fatal shot, while the rubberized apron caught any telltale blood spatter. He moved to examine the French Empire clock, now residing in his Piccadilly flat as a memento of the case. The stiffened lock mechanism created the perfect illusion of suicide, while her exit through the library window, secured from within using the curtain cords, completed the locked room deception. Every detail calculated, every contingency anticipated. It was, I admit, a virtuoso performance in the art of misdirection. Dr. Makepeace, who had provided the crucial parish records that unraveled Margaret's original exile, found whimsy in the dim church where the investigation had begun. "There will be scandal," he said gently. "Families whose grief has had 20 years to harden into acceptance. Scandal is the inevitable tax levied by truth upon comfortable lies," Whimsy replied, his voice carrying that note of philosophical resignation which marked his more serious moments. "As for grief, better honestly felt than sustained by elaborate fiction, the dead children of this village have waited 20 years for justice. They shall have it at last." As he prepared to depart Blackwood Grange for the final time, Whimsy stood once more in the violated sanctuary of the library, contemplating the curious psychology of those who believe themselves beyond moral accountability. The stranger who had knocked on Thursday had been no phantom, but something far more disturbing. A human being who had learned to live without conscience, sustained by the fiction that exile constituted sufficient penance for murder. "Come, Bunter," he announced, reaching for his hat with that languid gesture which indicated the successful conclusion of intellectual exercise. "We have done what could be done. The machinery of justice will complete what we have begun, and the dead may finally rest in peace. There remains only the business of returning to London, and perhaps a decent bottle of claret to wash away the taste of 20-year-old secrets." The church bell in the village tolled the hour with its accustomed melancholy, marking the end of a case that had spanned decades and the beginning of a justice too long delayed. The game was over, the players dispersed, and Lord Peter Wimsey departed into the gathering dusk with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had successfully unraveled one of the most psychologically complex crimes of his distinguished career. The stranger who knocked on Thursday would trouble no more peaceful English evenings. But somewhere in the shadows of respectable society, other arrangements were undoubtedly being made, other secrets carefully buried. The game, as Whimsy was fond of observing, never truly ended. It merely paused between moves, waiting for the next player clever enough to believe they could outwit both time and consequence. The machinery of official consequence moved with that peculiar combination of haste and deliberation which marked bureaucratic embarrassment confronting inconvenient truth. Within a fortnight of Margaret Blackwood's conviction, Whimsy found himself summoned to a discreet luncheon at the India Office, where under-secretaries with minds like well-oiled filing cabinets suggested that certain particulars might be better consigned to archives, where dust accumulates quickly and researches slowly. "You may seal what concerns the residency's bookkeeping," Whimsy replied, buttering his roll with pointed attention, "but you will not mislay the deaths of 3 children into a footnote. If the Empire insists upon its illusions, let it at least forgo illusions purchased at that price." The official across from him, a man whose career had been built upon the careful management of uncomfortable truths, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps the matter could be handled with appropriate discretion, Lord Peter. The reputation of the service—" "Pray omit it in italics," Whimsy interrupted with that glacial courtesy which had intimidated criminals across 3 continents. "I have no desire to be an adjective in your departmental memoirs." Meanwhile, In the village that had unknowingly harbored such secrets, the aftermath of revelation created ripples that disturbed the placid surface of rural life more profoundly than the initial murder. Mrs. Pemberton moved through her duties with a new, almost spectral quietness. The knowledge that her gentle master had been complicit in such dark arrangements, having shattered her faith in the reliability of human nature. "To think," she murmured to Bunter during his final inspection of the Grange, "all those years and never a hint. It just goes to show you never truly know what goes on behind closed doors." "Indeed, Mrs. Pemberton," Bunter replied with his customary sagacity. "The human heart, like a well-kept cellar, often conceals its choicest vintages and its darkest secrets alike." Dr. Makepeace's sermon the following Sunday treated of justice and mercy, arguing with considerable theological sophistication that the two, if kept separate too long, rot into hypocrisy. The congregation listened with that particular intensity reserved for moral instruction that touched too closely upon recent events. Arthur Finch, summoned from London with the expectation of formal charges, found himself instead the recipient of official apologies and Whimsy's characteristically precise advice. "Gratitude is a luxury, like vintage port," Whimsy observed. "Do not force it. Go home, Mr. Finch. Try honesty. It requires considerably less rehearsal than sustained deception." The psychological complexity of Margaret's case continued to fascinate Whimsy during his return journey to London. Her 20-year exile had been designed not merely to protect society, but to protect her from a world that would never understand the casual nature of her violence. Dr. Thornley's evaluation had confirmed what Whimsy had suspected from the beginning. Not madness, but something far more disturbing. A mind of considerable intelligence entirely lacking in what the alienists termed moral sentiment. "The curious thing about elaborate deceptions, Bunter," Whimsy observed as the Sussex countryside rolled past their railway carriage windows, "is their tendency to become more real than reality to those who practice them." Margaret had lived so long as Mary Montrose that she genuinely believed herself the injured party. 20 years of comfortable exile, and she considered herself the victim of her brother's betrayal. The French Empire clock, now restored to perfect accuracy and residing in Whimsy's Piccadilly flat, chimed the hour with mechanical precision, a permanent reminder that time, like truth, could be manipulated but never truly controlled. Its deceptive rhythm had enabled murder, but it had also provided the crucial evidence that led to justice. As evening settled over London with its familiar sounds of civilization, Whimsy reflected upon the curious satisfaction that accompanied the successful resolution of complex crimes. The stranger who had knocked on Thursday would trouble no more peaceful English evenings, but somewhere in the shadows of respectable society, other arrangements were undoubtedly being made, other secrets carefully buried. "We are all archivists, Bunter," he mused, settling into his favorite chair with a glass of particularly excellent claret. "Though most of us file by forgetting, it will not do. If people must be concealed, conceal them by kindness, not by accountancy." The game, as he was fond of observing, never truly ended. It merely paused between moves, waiting for the next player clever enough to believe they could outwit both time and consequence. Winter dusk settled upon London with that peculiar quality of finality which seems to mark the conclusion of complex human enterprises, and Whimsy found himself contemplating the curious psychology of resolution as he examined the latest correspondence from Sussex. The machinery of justice had moved with its customary deliberation, Margaret Blackwood's sentence carried out with that institutional efficiency which transforms the most extraordinary human dramas into mere administrative procedures. Parker arrived bearing news wrapped in the sort of official envelope that suggested bureaucratic tidiness had finally been imposed upon inconvenient truth. Margaret had declined to appeal, listening to her sentence with that same flat composure which had marked her throughout their brief but memorable acquaintance. The India Office, ruffled yet resolute, had agreed to limited disclosure, The residency books corrected, the forged certificates annotated with honest addenda, the children's names finally acknowledged in the parish records where they belonged. "There is something profoundly instructive," Whimsy observed, adjusting the French Empire clock on his mantle until it showed perfect accuracy, "about a crime that was both meticulously planned and yet utterly devoid of conventional passion. Margaret killed not from hatred or greed, but from the cold logic of self-preservation, carried to its most terrible conclusion." The aftermath had scattered the dramatis personae with that inevitability which marks the conclusion of any well-constructed tragedy. Arthur Finch had found employment with a small firm that prized accuracy more than charm. His bitter years of resentment finally transformed into something resembling useful purpose. Mrs. Pemberton had given notice, explaining with characteristic directness that she preferred to scrub a clean cottage than dust a compromised conscience. The gardener Hobbs had reclaimed his scaffold plank and, after a moment's philosophical reflection, cut it into kindling for the winter fires. "The curious thing about Margaret's 20-year arrangement," Whimsy continued, settling into his favorite chair with a glass of particularly excellent claret, "was never the monthly payments themselves, but what they represented. Not blackmail in any conventional sense, but the price of maintaining an identity that made restraint psychologically possible. Mary Montrose was not merely Margaret Blackwood's alias. She was her salvation." Bunter, who had been polishing the silver with that methodical attention to detail which had proved so invaluable during their recent investigation, paused in his work. "A most sophisticated form of self-imprisonment, my lord." "Precisely, Bunter. For 20 years, Margaret lived as Mary Montrose, respectable, scholarly, invisible. The monthly payments sustained not merely her physical existence, but the elaborate psychological construction that kept her dangerous appetites safely contained. When the India Office investigation threatened to expose that construction, she faced not merely imprisonment, but reversion to what she had been before, what she remained beneath all the careful layering of civilized behavior. The implications were as chilling as they were illuminating. Margaret's exile had been successful not because it reformed her, but because it provided her with an identity that made moral restraint bearable. The threat of exposure had endangered not merely her freedom, but society's protection from the creature that Mary Montrose's careful construction had kept safely caged. Dr. Makepeace's letter, delivered that morning, had requested the courtesy of a final ceremony, a single toll of the chapel bell for the children whose deaths had never been properly acknowledged, and for the man who had mistaken elaborate secrecy for genuine salvation. The vicar's precise handwriting conveyed both grief and a sort of austere satisfaction that truth had finally been permitted to serve justice rather than convenience. "We shall attend, naturally," Whimsy announced, though his voice carried that note of philosophical resignation which marked his encounters with humanity's more complex moral failures. "There is an economy of grace in calling things by their names, and the dead have waited quite long enough for their proper recognition." As evening deepened beyond the tall windows of his Piccadilly flat, Whimsy reflected upon the curious satisfaction that accompanied the resolution of truly complex crimes. The stranger who had knocked on Thursday had been revealed not as phantom or simple criminal, but as something far more disturbing, a human being who had learned to live with the knowledge of her own monstrosity, sustained by an elaborate fiction that made civilization possible. "Some mysteries, Bunter," he observed, raising his glass to the restored accuracy of the French Empire clock, "are solved not by discovering what happened, but by understanding why it could not have happened otherwise. Margaret Blackwood died in 1895 to preserve the world from Margaret Blackwood. When that death was threatened with exposure, she chose to make it permanent rather than risk resurrection. The clock chimed the hour with mechanical precision, marking the end of a case that had spanned decades and the beginning of questions that would persist long after justice had been served. Outside, London pursued its evening rhythm in the confident belief that darkness held nothing more dangerous than fog and the occasional pickpocket. Lord Peter Wimsey, standing at his window with the satisfied air of a scholar who has successfully passed a particularly complex text, reflected that civilization's greatest triumph lay not in eliminating human monsters, but in teaching them to cage themselves. The stranger who knocked on Thursday would trouble no more peaceful English evenings, but her final lesson would echo through his memory like a bell tolling in an empty chapel. That sometimes the most merciful solution was also the most terrible, and that the price of such mercy was eternal vigilance against the comfortable lies that made it necessary. "Come, Bunter," he announced, reaching for his evening clothes with that languid gesture which indicated the successful conclusion of intellectual exercise. "We have a ceremony to attend, and then perhaps a decent dinner to wash away the taste of 20-year-old secrets. The game is over, but there will be others. There always are. Human nature, like a well-stocked library, contains multitudes, and not all of them bear comfortable examination. The machinery of justice would complete its work. The dead would finally rest in acknowledged peace, and Lord Peter Wimsey would return to his books and his wine, secure in the knowledge that truth, however delayed, had finally been permitted to serve its proper function. The rest, as he was fond of observing, was merely the business of living with the consequences, a task he left to others with considerably less philosophical detachment and considerably more faith in the perfectibility of human nature.